Hello there. Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. We are in the midst of Act 1, Defining Directing, where we introduced the flame paradigm in Scene 1, dove into the F of flame, facilitation/translation, in Scene 2, and now we're going to dive into Scene 3, leadership. If this is your first encounter with Deconstructing Directing, you can learn more about it and us either in the video description if you're watching this directly on YouTube, or via the library tab if you're watching this on our website. Along with this video, there are links to the PDF transcript and the podcast version of this content below, along with a few worksheets and other resources that you might find helpful in your journey as a director. Let's keep stoking this flame and move along to L, leadership. Now, there are as many definitions for leadership as there are people in the world, it feels like. Throughout history, the idea of what makes someone a leader has shifted and changed from the idea that leaders are born, not made, to what feels like the polar opposite idea that anyone can learn to be a leader. If you Google the phrase define leadership, you'll see a lot of definitions about inspiring others to follow or about being able to get a group of people working together toward the same goal. If you ask folks about the qualities of a great leader, you might hear terms like charismatic, inspirational, visionary, decisive, and more words like empathetic and humble might enter the equation. Author, speaker, and futurist Jacob Morgan asked 14 CEOs to define leadership. His full article is linked below, but looking at those 14 definitions, we can find some common themes. 10 of the 14 definitions refer to supporting or helping others. 10 of the 14 definitions refer to inspiring people or setting a vision. 9 of the 14 definitions refer to results, achievements, or outcomes. And 6 of the 14 definitions mention something related to improvement, empathy, or other references to doing the right thing. Using these 14 definitions, then, we might say that a leader is supportive/empathetic, inspirational, humble, and gets results. We can stop there, right? Just do those 4 things and you will be a great leader. Or perhaps questions have started to pop into your mind, like, how do I know if I'm being supportive? Who decides that? What does it mean to be inspirational exactly? How can I be humble when I have to be the one in charge and make decisions? Wait, what results am I supposed to get exactly? So let's look at 3 ways that we can address these questions. Behavioralizing our values, disconnecting leadership from position, and using the lens of advocacy. First, we can behavioralize our values, which is just a specific way of being specific. Like we talked about in the previous scene on facilitation, one of the most common mistakes all theater artists seem to make is operating from assumptions rather than specificity. And there are often a lot of assumptions tied up in value terms like these. I call these value terms because they speak to a number of intangible qualities that we often say that we care about or seek out, thus, things that we value. So, how do we avoid those assumptions? By defining our values by the behaviors we expect to see in someone who claims to share those values. In other words, actually defining how we put these ideas into practice rather than leaving that to be assumed. Let's look at the idea of humility. We can list humility as a quality we want to have as leaders, sure, but what happens when we follow it up by saying that as leaders, we want to show humility by recognizing the competencies and knowledge of our team explicitly, either verbally or in writing on a regular basis, both to the team members and to those above us in the hierarchy. Actively seeking out feedback about our leadership and communication from our team, and listening non-defensively on a regular basis, on a project basis if not more frequently. Asking team members to accomplish tasks rather than ordering or demanding, or deferring to them on things that are clearly within their role. So for example, we need you to do X and Y, and I know you handle X well, so will you take care of it? I'll handle Y. And implementing changes to expectations and culture ourselves, either first or simultaneously with our team, and remaining transparent about our efforts. Now we have a much clearer picture of what we mean when we say that we want to show humility as leaders. And even if you don't agree with all of those behaviors being necessary in someone who is humble, we can now have a much more productive conversation about how our definitions differ than we could if we stopped at the value term alone. This also allows us to more effectively hold ourselves accountable if these ideas are expressed up front, because behaviors are observable and thus measurable, far more than ephemeral values. To help you on your own leadership journey, you can find a worksheet on the library page for this scene, linked below if you're watching this on YouTube, that will help you behavioralize values within your own definition of leadership in a similar manner. The second way that we can dig into questions about leadership is to disconnect our idea of leadership from position. Over the past 20 years, I've regularly heard comments about the prevalence of classes and degrees in leadership, but the lack of classes and degrees in followership. On the face of that comment, it might seem valid. After all, not everyone can be a leader, right? So it would follow that we need to help those who aren't leaders learn to be good followers. However, this dichotomy presumes that leadership is tied to position, specifically position within a hierarchy. Phrases like, "there's too many cooks in the kitchen," implies that there is a point at which too many people being involved in making a decision can make a process inefficient, which may be true. But being a decision maker and being a leader are not synonymous ideas. I'd be willing to bet that we've all experienced people in positions of power that make decisions who are horribly ineffective leaders, and we've all experienced great leaders who are not the ones in a decision-making position. In fact, I would argue that truly effective leaders are also the best followers, because they understand their role in a hierarchy or organization and thus are able to maximize the impact that they have on those around them. You may have heard of ideas like leading up, referring to how those at the bottom of institutional hierarchies can behave in a way that influences those above them in the hierarchy, or leading from the middle, where middle managers can exhibit leadership both up and down the hierarchy while remaining in a middle of the hierarchy position. However, if we define leadership as only something that those with decision-making power can exhibit, then it is much harder for leaders to be followers, because to them, they must have a position of power before they are willing to support, inspire, be humble, and drive results, leading them to engage in power struggles rather than support those who hold the decision-making power. One of my favorite pastimes outside of theater is playing tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, which, for those who don't know, is essentially a structured process for playing a collaborative, improvised game of make-believe, with some rules to provide structure and dice rolls to provide a little chaos. In these games, I most often take on the role of Dungeon Master, or DM. Some folks call this person the Game Master, or GM, whose job is to be the curator and guide for the story, in many ways similar to a theater director. Some of my favorite folks to play with are those who DM in their other games, because they understand the balance that needs to exist in a collaborative environment, and they recognize the value that a prepared, engaged player adds to the experience. In other words, they exhibit the behaviors of one who values leadership even when they're not in the DM role. To help you think through how leadership can be separated from position, we've designed a worksheet below that gives you an opportunity to apply your own behavioralized definition of leadership to several roles in theater. Finally, the third way that we can address questions about leadership is to use a different lens to view leadership altogether, especially when we're in the role of a director. Often we think about leadership as being about power, even when we can separate leadership from our particular position. The power to inspire people, the power to get things done, even the power of humility, which seems counterintuitive. But what if we flip that on its head and look at leadership not through the lens of power, but the lens of responsibility? I am reminded of a scene from the 1993 movie Cool Runnings about the first Jamaican bobsled team to compete at a Winter Olympics. The coach, Irv, played by John Candy, is discussing with the team who will take the role of driver in the bobsled, the de facto leader of the team. Here's how he describes the role of the driver.
You see, Sanka, the driver has to work harder than anyone. He's the first to show up and the last to leave. When his teammates are all out drinking beer, he's up in his room studying pictures of turns. You see, a driver must remain focused 100% at all times. Not only is he responsible for knowing every inch of every course he races, he's also responsible for the lives of the other 3 people in his sled.
When I put leadership in the flame paradigm, this is the definition that I had in mind. I love being a director not because I love power, but because I love being centrally positioned to help support as many members of my team as I possibly can. And it's because my team members know that they can count on that support that they are willing to work with me over and over again. I know because I've asked them. So, to help behavioralize this idea of leadership as responsibility instead of power, I've created a new leadership model that I call advocacy-based leadership. The premise is simple. Our role as leaders in any context is to balance 4 types of advocacy. First, we need to advocate for our team to the institution or stakeholders. Second, we need to advocate on behalf of the institution or stakeholders to our team. Third, we need to demonstrate self-advocacy. And fourth, we need to guide our team to improve their own self-advocacy. To fully use this model, of course, we need to be specific about what we mean by advocacy. In the simplest definition, advocating for something means to be in favor of it. And while that's an important element in the context of leadership, it's not enough to just be in favor of things. In this context, advocacy means using the privilege we have in any given position to amplify or support the voices of others. We can be in literally any position within a hierarchy and still use these principles to guide our leadership. So the amount or type of privilege we have isn't the question. It's how we use the privilege we have. So when we talk about advocating for our team, we are amplifying their voices, which means we first have to know what their voices are saying. We have to listen and take time to understand their needs, often using our skills in facilitation and management to help make this possible. Advocacy is only advocacy if the people we are advocating for see it as a representative of their voice. Otherwise, it's just us putting words in their mouths. When we talk about advocating for the institution or stakeholders to our team, it's less about amplifying, as those folks likely already have most of the power in the relationship. Instead, it becomes about helping our team understand why those in power are making the decisions they are when they don't clearly explain, and helping to communicate the big picture on behalf of those above us in the hierarchy. This has also become a bright line for me as a leader. If I can no longer advocate for any part of what those above me are doing, then it's likely time for me to leave. Demonstrating self-advocacy is one of the harder elements to this way of seeing leadership because it requires a level of emotional intelligence and self-awareness that we may still be building. But as I mentioned at the top, this is all a balancing act. We will never have things perfectly balanced in a messy human world, but we can strive to find that balance. Self-advocacy might include setting and maintaining professional boundaries, disagreeing constructively and openly, and not being conflict avoidant, but not rushing toward conflict either. When those around us see us behaving in this way, it makes it easier for them to advocate for themselves. Which is the fourth part of advocacy-based leadership, encouraging others to advocate for themselves. This is far more explicit than you might think. It often literally sounds like saying, "Please tell me what you need," and then expectantly waiting for an answer. Especially in theater, many artists have been conditioned to de-emphasize their own needs, often because they were treated poorly for expressing needs in the past. This may have happened in a rehearsal room or at home, decades earlier or last week. But because of this, I find it's often more effective to frame it as a statement or imperative. Tell me what you need, versus, do you need anything? Because we're so conditioned to just say no to the question that it's often a subconscious response rather than one we actually think about. Now, it is important not to berate people for not knowing what they need or not having needs, but learning to create space for them to express their own perspective, whatever that may be. So let's put this 4-way leadership balancing act into action. I'm going to describe a situation in which you and I will take on the role of a director. After I explain the situation, I'll invite you to pause the video and take some time to think about how you might approach this situation, ideally through the lens of advocacy-based leadership. Then start the video back up and we'll talk through it. Heads up that there is no one right answer. This is messy and human, and the best course of action will depend a lot on who you are as a director. So, here's the scenario. You have been hired by a local community theater to direct a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream by the bard himself, William Shakespeare. You have a production team consisting of a movement and intimacy director, a set designer, sound and lighting designer, prop designer, stage manager, and costume designer, as well as a diverse cast of 15 actors. You are also responsible to the artistic director of the theater, who reports to the board of directors and whom, for the purpose of this example, we will call the producer. From the beginning of the process, your scenic and costume designers have been very excited to collaborate with one another on costume pieces that are integrated into the set, though they have been having difficulties agreeing on exactly how these would fit together. And at the production meeting yesterday, there was a bit of tension and disagreement between the two of them. Now, you weren't at the production meeting because you were sick, but still wanted the rest of the team to meet, and the stage manager wrote a detailed report for you. Unbeknownst to you, the producer was at the meeting after not being present at any rehearsals or production meetings since auditions. Today, the entire production team and all 15 actors received an email from the producer, clearly very upset at what they saw as a disorganized production, and saying that everyone needed to get on the same page and put their egos to the side, or else he was going to shut down the production or replace those who couldn't work together. So, how would you demonstrate leadership in this situation? Try to use the 4 elements of advocacy-based leadership if you can. Pause the video, give it some thought, and then come back and we'll talk about it. Welcome back. Let's dive into this "what would you do" scenario. It's a sticky situation, but probably doesn't seem that far outside the realm of possibilities. Maybe you've experienced a similar situation yourself, though I hope not. Let's start by looking at each of the 4 components of advocacy-based leadership in this context. Perhaps protectiveness for your team who didn't deserve to be spoken to in an email like that is one of your first instincts. It's a normal response when we perceive a threat to those that we care about. That protectiveness can drive us to advocate for our team, but it can also drive us to put words in their mouths if we haven't heard from them first. There is the possibility that the producer's email wasn't perceived the same by everyone in the production, though that's unlikely. Even if it was perceived negatively, those involved may not have had as strong a reaction as you do. Perhaps this is regular behavior by the producer, something that you, as an outside hire, may not know. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't jump to our team's defense, but simply something to consider as we seek to balance our advocacy-based leadership. When we think about advocating for the producer to the team, perhaps you might find it hard to want to back him up when he's already so clearly violated trust. Assuming this is the first time he's inserted himself so drastically into this process, perhaps speaking with him to understand his perspective would help you be able to advocate for those concerns among your cast and production team in a manner that's more supportive. Perhaps the conflict the day before was bigger than your stage manager made it out to be in the report. Perhaps the producer has received other complaints that folks didn't feel comfortable talking with you about. Gathering information about his perspective is helpful. Now, do be aware that if the behavior is so egregious that you cannot in good conscience advocate for the producer's perspective in any way to your team, it may be an indicator that this is a toxic space. Which brings us to our self-advocacy. How might we balance that in this situation? Perhaps one of your first reactions was feeling insulted, belittled, or offended that he went around you to communicate directly with the cast and crew. And that would be an understandable reaction. I think I might have those feelings initially as well. But advocating for ourselves does not mean rising to the behavior of those we must advocate for ourselves too. It means being able to define our needs and express our feelings while keeping our focus on what we can control. What would some of your needs be in this situation? Primary need I would probably express in this situation is the need to be consulted before emails are sent to the team about the process, since I'm the one ultimately responsible for the process. And note that this isn't about power or being seen as weak by those that I am responsible for, but rather that if there are concerns about the process, it's my responsibility to lead those conversations. And then finally, how can we encourage self-advocacy by our team in this situation? If in the course of events I learn that some members of the team were particularly hurt by the producer's words, I might offer to share those concerns on their behalf or be with them while they share them directly with the producer if they feel that they can do so. A middle ground might be encouraging them to put their feelings in writing and then collecting those things to share with the producer. However, it's very unlikely that many will feel comfortable speaking up at all for fear of retaliation, an all too familiar issue not just in theater but in the vast majority of hierarchical organizations. Whew. Yeah, this is a tricky balance, isn't it? Like I said earlier, there's no one right answer about how to approach a situation like this. I might start by checking in on the team via a separate email to encourage them, let them know that, hey, I'm going to speak with the producer, and seeing if they have any particular concerns that they would like me to address with him. Then I might call the producer or ask for an in-person conversation where I can inquire more about his concerns that led to this email, as well as share my concerns and advocate for my team. After that conversation, I might close the loop with the team and share appropriate details about my conversation with the producer, or perhaps in the best case scenario, he would be willing to write his own note of apology and share elements of what we discussed. In other words, for me, the balance in this situation leans away from encouraging self-advocacy and more toward advocacy for my team and advocacy for the producer. You might choose a different course of action, and that's okay too. If this perspective on leadership seems like it might be helpful, there's a worksheet down with all the other worksheets that has a graphic representation of the 4 elements to keep in balance. So, that's it. We've covered the F and L of our flame paradigm so far, which means next up is A. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more, for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you will still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I'll see you again when you are ready to dive into Act 1, Scene 4, Artistic Insight and Taste. Until then, may your flame burn bright, my fellow directors.